Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. In May 2002, in the quiet borough of Gray, Pennsylvania, an extraordinary encounter with the paranormal would challenge everything Mark Henderson thought he knew about the supernatural. Though a devoted fan of horror films and Halloween, Mark had always maintained a skeptical view of ghosts, dismissing them as Hollywood fabrications or childhood fantasies. That changed dramatically during what began as a routine visit to a local history museum. While touring a historical exhibit about early settler life in the area, Mark encountered what he describes as his first genuine supernatural experience, the apparition of a woman in period dress, clearly in mourning, standing near a display case. The figure appeared so solid, so real, that Mark initially mistook her for a museum tour guide in costume. Only when she turned toward him, her face streaked with tears, did he realise something wasn't as it should be. The apparition seemed focused on one particular display case before vanishing. Shaken by the experience, Mark sought out an actual tour guide and returned to the exhibit. To his surprise, that section was now inexplicably closed and incomplete. Inside the partially dismantled display case, near which he had witnessed the mourning woman, he now saw something that hadn't been visible before, a coffin which, according to the guide, had been long sealed before its discovery. The guide further elaborated, stating that the casket had contained the remains of a child and had been recovered from the nearby woods in Squirrel Hill. The sudden appearance of the coffin and its connection to the mourning apparition remained unexplained. This encounter forced Mark to adopt a new philosophical approach to the seemingly strange and absurd. Reason cannot resolve paradox, but faith destroys it. He realised that attempting to rationalise such an impossible experience would prove futile. The only path forward was acceptance of what he had witnessed, despite its defiance of logic. The museum encounter sparked a deeper interest in paranormal investigation beyond casual entertainment. Mark soon formed a partnership with fellow paranormal enthusiast Celina Martinez. Together, they began researching local ghost stories, particularly those claiming authenticity. However, their investigations rarely progressed beyond preliminary research, as both found themselves hesitating when faced with actual on-site investigations. This pattern of hesitation would change dramatically when they learned about Mystery Mile. The road held personal significance for Mark. Throughout his childhood, he and his father had frequently travelled its length, his father having lived along it in his youth and Mark in his, on an historic farm owned by their family. His father had always explained the road's unusual name as stemming from the unpredictable encounters commuters would have with farm animals that would dash across it, chickens, dogs, cows, and various other livestock appearing without warning. Mark had accepted this simple explanation without question, though he thought it a rather silly name for the road given this clarification. Years later, during a routine catch-up call, his father's voice carried an unusual tension when he broached the subject of his new ghost hunting hobby. He asked if he had ever revealed the true reason for moving away from Mystery Mile. When Mark repeated the familiar story about the farm being too much work to maintain, his father admitted this was only partly true. The true story of the family's departure from Mystery Mile, as Mark's father revealed, involved a series of bizarre and frightening occurrences that plagued the property. Beyond typical nighttime disturbances, the farm experienced strange phenomena that defied rational explanation. Livestock would become inexplicably terrified, fleeing in panic onto the road, where they often met tragic ends under passing vehicles. Bales of hay would be found violently torn apart and scattered across the yard, as if by some powerful unseen force. The animal feed would mysteriously become infested with insects overnight, despite being perfectly clean when stored. But the road itself harboured the most peculiar anomaly. What appeared superficially as a typical country highway revealed a disturbing pattern. At its heart, Mystery Mile would erupt into a mass of potholes and broken pavement. The Pennsylvania Department of Transportation's repeated attempts to repair this section proved futile. The road would deteriorate again within weeks. Eventually, the department abandoned their efforts entirely. While the rest of the road remained intact, this central section persisted in its state of decay, as if some force beneath the surface rejected any attempt at improvement. Intrigued by these revelations, Mark and Celina met at the Beaver Library to conduct preliminary research. While official records proved sparse, they uncovered unsettling rumours of occult activity in the area, though nothing had ever been officially substantiated. The lack of concrete information only strengthened their resolve to investigate firsthand. On a clear summer evening, they drove Mark's Chevrolet Cavalier to Mystery Mile. The sun was setting as they turned onto the ageing highway that cut through the dense forest along the Ohioville hillside. In the decades since Mark's last visit, the encroaching trees had nearly suffocated the road, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of vegetation. After driving approximately half a mile, they reached Mark's former home, now a dilapidated shell of the farmhouse he remembered from his childhood. The house stood in shambles, weathered by years of abandonment. Though unremarkable in its basic architecture, similar to countless other farmhouses across rural America, the property radiated an unsettling atmosphere. Overgrown grass surrounded the structure, and old hay lay scattered across the grounds, much as Mark's father had described from years before. As they exited their vehicle with flashlights and recording equipment, a deep, resonant cow's moo pierced the silence. A thorough scan of the empty barn and surrounding fields revealed no source for the sound. Though Mark suggested it might have originated from a nearby active farm, Celina's silent response spoke volumes about her unease. Their investigation began in the house's main entrance, which opened into a devastated living room. The ceiling had collapsed, leaving the upper floor partially exposed through a gaping hole above. The staircase had also caved in, rendering the second story physically inaccessible. The ground floor initially appeared unremarkable, beyond the presence of scurrying rats and occasional gusts of wind finding their way through broken windows and crumbling walls. The first truly unusual event occurred as Celina examined the debris around the fallen staircase. She suddenly experienced an intense, localised cold spot, her teeth chattering uncontrollably, her skin turning ice cold to the touch, her breath becoming visible in the summer air. The phenomenon vanished the instant she stepped away from that specific area. Then came the sounds from above, footsteps, initially singular and deliberate, multiplying into what seemed like running. A very soft female scream echoed through the walls, though Mark would later describe it as more of a whispering wail than a true scream. Then the running abruptly stopped. As Mark searched frantically for a rational explanation, a loose window, falling debris, anything, a door on the second floor slowly creaked open. What emerged defied easy description. Though roughly human-sized, the entity itself seemed to be terrified, Mark distinctly sensing its intense fear. It moved swiftly toward the stairs before vanishing into thin air. Celina, standing mere feet away, hadn't witnessed the apparition. Suddenly, a cacophony of agitated animal sounds erupted outside. Cows, horses, chickens, all in apparent distress. They both rushed to the porch, only for absolute silence to descend the moment their feet touched the wooden planks. "I think this might be a bit more real than we thought," Mark remarked to Celina, his attempt at humour barely masking his growing unease. Deciding to investigate the deteriorated section of road, they drove barely a quarter-mile before encountering the infamous potholes. These weren't typical road damage, they were crater-like depressions so deep that soil was visible at their bases. They parked with headlights illuminating the scene and ventured into the woods, which seemed to have grown impossibly denser in the short time since their arrival. As they explored the forest's edge, Mark and Celina noticed subtle but unsettling changes in their surroundings. The temperature began to drop steadily despite the summer evening air. The wind, which had been merely a whisper through the trees, picked up strength, sending leaves skittering across the broken pavement. Most disturbing was the darkness. The forest seemed to be growing impossibly darker, as if the trees themselves were drawing shadows closer. It was then, as Mark turned to suggest they return to the car, that he witnessed something extraordinary, a silver-blue mist hovering above the road beyond his vehicle. The mist didn't behave like normal fog, it moved with purpose, gradually separating into distinct humanoid figures. Their clothing appeared centuries old, the details becoming clearer as the form solidified. These apparitions, now fully formed, arranged themselves in a perfect circle in the road's centre. Though one seemed to speak, the words were barely perceptible, like half-heard conversations at the edge of sleep. The wind intensified dramatically, bringing with it a horrifying chorus of sounds, agonised screams, desperate pleas for mercy, and beneath it all, a deep, menacing growl, unlike anything Mark had ever heard. This wasn't the growl of any natural animal. It was deeper, darker, more terrifying than any earthly creature could produce. Though every instinct screamed at him to run, Mark found himself paralysed, unable to look away from the spectral scene before him. Then came the footsteps from deep within the forest, growing steadily louder and more deliberate. Trees shook violently, leaves cascaded down, and something was approaching through the darkness. Mark felt gripped by an overwhelming sense of dread and a bone-deep certainty that if he didn't escape immediately, he never would. The feeling transcended normal fear. It was primal, absolute terror. Breaking free from his paralysis, Mark sprinted toward his car, the footsteps growing closer with each step. Celina arrived seconds later, her expression reflecting the same profound terror he felt. They locked themselves in the vehicle, catching their breath as the apparitions vanished and an eerie silence returned to the forest. Before Mark could start the engine, the disturbance resumed with even greater intensity. Every tree in sight seemed to shake violently as the screams returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. Celina sat frozen, her eyes fixed on something outside her window. One look between them said everything. They had to get out. The car started and they fled down Mystery Mile as the misty figures materialised around them, accompanied by that same blood-curdling growl that seemed to follow them until they reached the end of the road. A month after their escape, Mark and Celina returned to Beaver Library for further research. This time, they discovered a previously overlooked microfilm containing a crucial piece of information. An article about the slaying of several young men in the Ohioville forests, which had occurred a decade before Mystery Mile was even paved. The victims, members of a local cult numbering about half a dozen, were found arranged in a perfect circle around what appeared to be some kind of ritual altar. While authorities had dismissed supernatural explanations, local superstition suggested the group had inadvertently released a malevolent entity through a summoning ritual, a dark force that showed them the consequences of delving too deeply into the occult. The case remained officially unsolved, but Mark and Celina realised they had likely witnessed multiple types of haunting phenomena that night. An interactive haunting in the house, a residual haunting of the cult's final moments, and perhaps most disturbingly, an encounter with what Mark describes as the darkest of spirits. The location of their ghostly circle exactly matched the spot where the road repeatedly broke apart, suggesting a connection between the cult's demise and the road's mysterious deterioration. The scattered hay and terrified animals at Mark's childhood home suddenly took on a new meaning. Not random paranormal events, but manifestations of something much darker. The experience left Mark reeling. What he had learned from modern paranormal investigators about their classification of hauntings now seemed woefully inadequate. What he and Celina had encountered that night shattered their neat theoretical categories. In the end, he wasn't sure anyone could explain what happened on Mystery Mile. He certainly couldn't. The experience left such a profound impact that Mark seriously considered abandoning paranormal investigation entirely. Years later, neither Mark nor Celina can fully explain what they encountered in those woods, but both remain convinced that something ancient and malevolent continues to lurk along Mystery Mile, waiting in the darkness between the trees. Mark's final reflection was simple and honest. While science may not have all the answers, he's no longer certain anyone does, himself included. Mystery Mile keeps its secrets.